There is a kind of damage in this industry that nobody writes home about. It has a name, and the name is fish bite. If you work on a seismic survey vessel, you have seen it, or you have seen the paperwork for it, and either way, you did not stop what you were doing. A cable comes back on the drum with a hole in the jacket. Somebody notes the section, somebody notes the channel, and the box on the form gets a tick. I want to be completely clear about how ordinary this is before I tell you anything else. There is published research on sharks biting seismic streamers. There is a paper in a reliability engineering journal about it, which is not where you look for sea monsters. There is a survey off New Zealand where the biting got so bad that the crew finished the job on a shortened cable and a shorter record because they could not keep the full length in the water. And there is a patent, a real one, for a device that goes off when something bites the gear, because the problem is expensive enough that somebody sat down and invented a machine to make it stop. So when a survey vessel reports damage to a streamer, the correct reaction, the professional reaction, the reaction that every person reading this file had, is to log it and carry on. That is what happened here. The section was recovered, the damage was logged, the survey lost a night, and the client lost nothing at all. There is only one thing in this file that does not fit, and it is not dramatic, and you would not notice it unless you knew what you were looking at. The damage was in two places at once. Not two bites in a row. Two receiver groups side by side on the same cable, going noisy in the same instant. And the depth control bird that sits on the cable between them was gone off its clamp. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, because I read these. Have you ever seen something out on the water that you could not explain afterwards? And where are you watching from? I ask because the people in this story were not looking for anything. They were doing the most boring job in the ocean, which is dragging a very long ruler through the dark and writing down what it touched. There is a piece of footage from that night, and I want to deal with it now rather than save it, because saving it would be dishonest. A seismic spread carries cameras. Not for wildlife and not for drama. They are there because the gear is expensive and because things go wrong with it in the dark, and a camera on a tow point is cheaper than sending a man out to look. The clip is about 30 seconds long, and it is not good footage. It is a working light, a lot of black water, and the cable running away out of the frame. And people forget, when they think about a seismic survey, how shallow that cable actually is. A streamer tows somewhere between 5 and 20 meters down. That is not the deep ocean. That is the depth of a swimming pool stood on its end, and it is close enough to the surface that a light on the back deck reaches it on a calm night. So what you are looking at is not a mystery in the abyss. It is a lit cable, a few meters under, with something moving alongside it. The thing alongside it is not the cable. You cannot see an animal in that clip, and I am not going to tell you that you can. What you can see is that the water beside the cable is not behaving the way the water everywhere else in the frame is behaving, and that whatever is displacing it is running parallel to 8 kilometers of towed equipment, keeping pace and staying there. Then the light loses it, and the clip ends. And for about a year, that was a piece of footage that a few people on a boat had seen and nobody else had. I need to explain what a seismic spread is, because everything in this story is a consequence of how one is built, and almost nobody outside the industry knows. A survey vessel tows cables called streamers. Each one is around 8 kilometers long, which is about 5 miles. She does not tow one of them. She tows a spread of them, side by side, separated by 100 meters or more, so that from above the vessel is dragging a rectangle of instrumented cable across the sea that is kilometers long and more than a kilometer wide. That rectangle is the single largest man-made object most people will never see. Now here is the part that matters. A streamer is not one sensor. It is a line of receiver groups spaced about 12.5 meters apart along its length, and every one of those groups is recorded on its own numbered channel. 12.5 meters. Write that number down, because the entire story turns on it. That spacing is not a safety feature, and it is not a measuring device. It is a sampling decision made for one purpose, which is to build a usable image of the rock several kilometers beneath the seabed. And because a processor sitting in an office months later has to be able to find one bad trace among millions, every group has a number, and every number is written down. The same is true of where the cable is. You cannot build a seismic image if you do not know where your receivers were when they heard something. So the industry spends an enormous amount of money knowing exactly that. There are compasses on the cable and acoustic units that range across from one streamer to the next, and there are satellite receivers on buoys at the tail of every line. The requirement is roughly 5 meters of accuracy at the head and the tail of a streamer, and about 12 in the middle. I want you to sit with how strange that is for a moment. 5 meters is a hopeless way to measure a fish. If you handed a marine biologist a system that could tell them where something was to within 5 meters, they would laugh at you, because most of what they study is smaller than the error bar. But 5 meters is a perfectly good way to measure a boat. And that is the whole problem with what happened that night. Nothing on that vessel was built to measure an animal. Everything on that vessel was built to know, precisely and continuously, where 8 kilometers of cable was and what was touching it. The night itself is undramatic, and I am going to walk through it in order. The vessel had come to the end of a line. That matters more than anything else in this account, and I will come back to it twice. At the end of a line, the source stops firing. The vessel begins a long, slow turn to come back onto the next one, and for a while she is simply towing gear through the dark with nothing to do. The positioning system does not stop during a turn. It cannot, because the one thing you must never lose track of is where 5 miles of cable is while you are turning a ship around on top of it. So the compasses were running, the acoustics were ranging, the tail buoys were reporting, and the recording system was idling. At some point in that turn, the noise came up on the back deck monitors.
Bridge, back deck. We have noise on the tail section, 2 groups, and the bird between them is gone.
That is the first thing anybody said about it out loud, and I would ask you to notice how flat it is. That is a man reporting a broken piece of equipment. The answer came back from the bridge, and it is the answer that would make sense to anybody who has worked out there.
Back deck bridge. Source is down, line is over, nothing should be near that cable.
Nothing should be near that cable. Hold on to that sentence. Later that night, when the shape of the thing had started to bother people, somebody on that bridge did something that crews do not usually do over a routine gear fault. They asked the water who else was out there.
Any station, this is the survey vessel. Has anyone got gear working this block tonight?
Nobody had gear working that block that night. I am going to stop here and ask you to commit to something, because this is the moment the crew were in, and I want you in it with them. Forget everything you know about what this channel usually turns out to be. At this point in the night, all anybody had was a piece of equipment that had been damaged across a span, in the dark, with the guns silent, and nobody else working that water. What do you think did that? Say it now, before I show you a single number, and remember what you said, because I am going to come back to it later, and I suspect a lot of you are going to be more right than you expect, and wrong in a way you will not see coming. The first explanation, the one that got written down before anybody had thought about it very hard, is the least interesting explanation available, and it is almost always right. The cable failed. Cables fail. They are dragged through salt water for months at a time under constant tension. They are wound onto drums and off them. They are handled by tired people at night, and they spend their whole working life being pulled through a medium that is trying to destroy them. Gear failure is the answer that explains 99 incidents out of 100, and it should always be the first answer on the list. I am not going to break it with a story. I am going to break it with the way the cable was damaged. If a streamer fails under load, it fails at its strength members, which are the parts that carry the tension. And the failure runs along the axis of the cable because that is the direction the force is in. That is not what came back on the drum. The strength members had not parted. The outer jacket was deformed across a stretch of its length, not punctured at a point and not parted at a joint, and the depth control bird had been torn sideways off its clamp. Sideways. That is a load applied across the cable from outside it, over a distance, by something that was not the tow. Gear failure does not do that, and every person who looked at that section knew it within about 10 seconds of seeing it. I want to tell you who these people are, because I think the picture most viewers have of an oil and gas survey vessel is wrong, and it matters for how you weigh what they say. A seismic boat is not a rig, and it is not a drilling operation. It is a slow, unglamorous ship that spends months at a time driving in enormous straight lines at 4.5 knots, turning around and driving back. The work is done in 12-hour watches, and the great enemy of everybody aboard is boredom. The people on the back deck are technicians. They repair cable, they change out birds, they splice sections, and they spend their working lives handling a piece of equipment that is longer than most cities are wide. Nobody out there is a romantic about the ocean. They are a long way from home on a fixed rotation. They are being paid a day rate, and the sea is the thing that keeps breaking their gear. I say all of that because there is a version of this story where a crew of nervous men in the dark talk themselves into a monster, and I do not think that is what this is. The first man to see the noise on those 2 channels did not say anything about an animal. He reported a broken bird and asked for the winch to stop. The log entry he wrote that night runs to one line, and the one line is about equipment. Whatever anybody thought later, on the night itself, this was a maintenance problem happening to people who fix things for a living. So the first explanation is gone, and we have a piece of damaged equipment on a deck. And now we have to talk about the thing that everybody in the comments is already typing. The guns. A seismic survey makes sound. That is the entire method, and there is no polite way around it. A source array is towed behind the vessel, and it releases compressed air in a precisely timed burst, and that burst travels down through the water and into the rock and comes back up, and the receivers listen for it. It is loud. It is one of the loudest routine noises that human beings make in the ocean, and there is a genuine, serious, decades-long scientific and regulatory argument about what that does to marine life. I want to give that argument its full weight because I think it deserves it, and because the ordinary explanation here is not stupid. There are real studies on behavioral change in fish and marine mammals near active surveys. There are real regulations built on top of those studies. Every survey of this kind operates under an environmental authorization with conditions attached, and those conditions are why there are marine mammal observers on the bridge, why the source ramps up slowly instead of starting at full power, and why there are rules that require the guns to shut down if a large animal comes inside a defined range. At night, when a visual watch is useless, the vessel listens instead, with hydrophones dedicated to detecting animals rather than rock. So the ordinary story writes itself. A survey vessel was making an enormous noise in the dark, and something large and distressed came at the source of that noise and hit the gear. If you told me that story with no other information, I would believe it. Here is why it cannot be what happened. The guns were not firing. The line was over. The source had been shut down at the end of the line, exactly as it is shut down at the end of every line, and the vessel was in her turn. Whatever came alongside 8 kilometers of cable, that night did not come to the sound of the air guns, because at that moment, the loudest man-made object in that part of the ocean was making no noise at all. It came to something else. And now we have to deal with the answer that the industry itself would give you, which is the strongest ordinary explanation in this entire story, and which took me the longest to let go of. Fish bite. I have already told you it is real, and I want to go further than that, because the strength of this explanation is the whole reason nobody looked at this file for a year. Sharks bite these cables. It is documented in the open literature, it is studied seriously, and it is treated as an engineering problem rather than as a curiosity. The industry's own explanation for why is worth stating carefully, because it is an explanation and not a proven fact. The gear carries electrical current down its length, and the leading idea is that the field around it reads to an animal that hunts using electrical sense, like something alive. A shark finds prey partly by detecting the tiny electrical fields that muscles and nerves make. So the leading hypothesis is that a seismic streamer to a shark feels like a very long, very stupid animal that will not stop swimming. I find that idea genuinely unsettling, and I want to be honest that it is the industry's working explanation rather than a settled finding. The damage it causes is well characterized. It is a puncture. Small sharks work the outer jacket. They get a tooth or two through it. The cable takes on water or loses a section of its electrical continuity, and one channel goes bad. One animal, one mouth, one group. That is what fish bite looks like on a record, and it is why nobody looks twice at it. And the response to the problem tells you everything about its shape. The patented answer to shark damage on survey gear is a device that is triggered by an impact. You put something on the cable that reacts when a thing bites it. That whole idea only makes sense if what you are defending against is a bite, in one place, by one mouth. Now look at the section that came back on that drum. We are not arguing about whether sharks bite these cables, because they do. And we are not arguing about whether that is normal, because it is. What came back was not a hole. There was no puncture through the jacket at a point. There was a stretch of cable deformed along its length, a piece of hardware torn off sideways, and two channels going noisy in the same instant instead of one going noisy on its own. Fish bite describes a kind of damage. It does not describe this one, and it was never meant to. There is one more thing from that night that I have not told you, and it belongs here rather than later, because it is the part that made the crew stop treating this as paperwork. It happened twice. The noise came up on those two groups, and it went away. And 7 seconds later, it came back. The tow load trace shows it plainly, and a tow load trace is about as unromantic a document as exists on a working ship. It is a line that goes up when the drag on the cable increases and down when it does not. That line shows a load arriving and leaving. And then, 7 seconds later, arriving again and leaving again. Something took hold of a cable, let go of it deliberately, and took hold of it a second time. Now we can talk about the measurement, and I want to do it slowly, because it is the only measurement anybody has ever taken of this animal, and it was taken by accident, by people who were not looking at it. Go back to the number I asked you to write down. Receiver groups are spaced about 12.5 meters apart along the cable. Each group is a separate numbered channel, and each channel is recorded separately, because that is the only way a processor can ever find a bad trace. If an animal takes hold of a cable, it is in contact with a stretch of that cable roughly as long as the animal is. A shark that is 6 meters long is in contact with 6 meters of cable. 6 meters is not 12.5. A 6-meter animal, anywhere along that cable, at any angle, in any position, touches one receiver group. It cannot touch two, because the two are further apart than the animal is long. That night, 2 adjacent groups went noisy at the same instant. Not in sequence. Not one and then the other, as something moved along the cable. At the same instant, on 2 channels, 12.5 meters apart, with the depth control bird that sat between them torn off its clamp. And I know what the sharpest people watching this are about to ask, because it is the right question, and it is the one I asked. How does anybody know it was the same instant? If those 2 channels went noisy half a second apart, everything I have just told you collapses, because then it is one animal moving along a cable and touching one group and then the next, and the 12.5 meters is a distance it swam rather than a distance it spanned. The answer is the single most boring fact in seismic acquisition, and it happens to save this entire argument. A seismic recording system does not record channels one at a time. It samples every channel in the spread together, on a common clock, into the same record. Because the whole method depends on knowing that what channel 400 heard and what channel 401 heard happened at the same moment relative to one another. The timing precision that people talk about in this industry belongs to the shot instant and to that satellite-locked sample clock, not to any individual sensor deciding for itself when to listen. Every group in the spread is written down together on the same tick, thousands of times a second. So the question of whether two channels went bad simultaneously is not a matter of anybody's judgment or anybody's stopwatch. They are either noisy on the same sample or they are not. They were on the same sample, not half a second apart and not a tenth. The same one. That gives you a number, and the number is not a length. It is a floor. Whatever was in contact with that cable was not less than 12.5 meters long. Not less than 12.5 meters, and probably more, because the odds of an animal sitting exactly on the minimum are poor. But the instrument will only support the floor, so the floor is all I will claim. And this is the point where I have to tell you what is wrong with my own evidence, because if I do not, somebody else will. The positioning on that cable is good to about 5 meters at the ends and 12 in the middle. That is coarse. It is genuinely coarse. And if I were trying to tell you that this animal was 15.4 meters long, that error bar would eat my claim whole, and I would deserve it. But I am not. I am telling you that two sensors 12.5 meters apart were touched at the same time, and there is no positional error in the world that turns one animal into two sensors. The coarseness of the instrument is the reason the number survives. It is far too blunt to measure a fish, and it is exactly sharp enough to measure something the size of a boat. The navigator who first put those two channel numbers side by side did it at about 4 in the morning, on a laptop, in a cabin, months after the fact. He has described what he did next, and it is the most human thing in this entire file. He measured his cabin. He wanted to know what 12.5 meters actually looked like, because it is one of those numbers that means nothing until you put it against something you can stand next to. His cabin was not long enough, so he went out into the corridor and paced it. 12.5 meters is most of the way along an accommodation corridor on a working survey vessel. He says he stood at one end of it and looked at the other end of it, and that was the moment the arithmetic stopped being arithmetic. Now, the answer that a lot of you will have given me a few minutes ago. Not the white shark. We will get to the white shark, and I promise you it gets the fight it deserves. The other one. The one that people who actually know this water reach for first, and the one that is by far the most reasonable thing anybody has said about this file. A whale. 12.5 meters is a whale. It is an unremarkable whale. A humpback is around that size, and a large one is bigger, and whales are in this water in numbers, and they are exactly the kind of animal that ends up caught in towed marine equipment. Whale entanglement in fishing and marine gear is real. It is documented. It is common enough to have dedicated response teams on several coastlines, and it is the single most credible explanation anybody has offered for what happened to that cable. I held on to the whale for a long time. You should too, for another minute, because I want to make the case properly. A whale is big enough to span 2 receiver groups without any difficulty at all. A whale is heavy enough to tear a depth-control bird off a clamp. A whale is exactly the sort of animal that could come into contact with a towed cable in the dark and leave this pattern behind. And the absence of a detection on the acoustic watch that night proves nothing whatsoever. Whales are not continuously vocal. A listening system has a limited range and a duty cycle, and a visual observer at night is blind by definition. If you told me a whale did this, I could not use the acoustic log to argue with you, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Here is what breaks it, and it is not a sound, and it is not a sighting. It is that flat, boring line on the tow load trace. An entangled whale does not take hold of something and release it cleanly. That is not how entanglement works in any documented case, ever. Entanglement is a snarl. Gear wraps, and it stays wrapped, and the animal turns and rolls trying to get out of it, and the load on the line does not come and go. It builds, and it stays, and it drags. Response teams do not go out to whales that briefly touched some rope. They go out to animals that have been wearing it for weeks. The trace from that night shows a load that arrived and left, and then arrived and left again, 7 seconds later. 2 clean grips. Something that took hold, decided something, let go, and came back to take hold a second time on its own terms. That is not an accident happening to an animal. That is an animal doing something on purpose, twice. I want to stay with those 2 grips for a moment, because everybody I have spoken to about this file gets stuck in the same place, and it is not the size. It is the 7 seconds. Think about what has to happen inside them. Something comes onto a cable in the dark and takes hold of it hard enough to deform the jacket and tear a fitting off sideways. And then it lets go. A thing that is stuck does not let go. A thing that is panicking does not let go cleanly and then hold still for 7 seconds. What lets go is something that has finished doing whatever it was doing. And what comes back 7 seconds later is something that has considered the result and decided to do it again. There is a word for that in the literature on large predators, and the word is investigation. Big sharks investigate unfamiliar objects with their mouths because that is the instrument they have. They take hold of a thing, they assess it, and they let it go if it is not food. And the reason this is the part that unsettles people is that it is the only moment in this entire file where you can see something making a decision. Every other piece of evidence here is a measurement. That one is a mind, which leaves the answer most of you gave me, and the answer anybody who knows this coastline gives first, and the one that has to die last, because it is the only one with real teeth in it. A large white shark. I want to be fair to this, because it is not a silly answer. This is white shark water. There are seal colonies on this coast in numbers that are difficult to describe to somebody who has not stood near one. Hundreds of thousands of animals in a single stretch of rock, and where there are seals in those numbers, there are white sharks that grow very large on them. And white sharks demonstrably interact with this exact equipment. That is not speculation. That is the literature I cited 20 minutes ago. So the ordinary answer here is not merely plausible. It is local. It is documented. And it is what I would have said too. It dies on 12.5 meters. The largest white shark ever reliably measured is around 6 meters. There are bigger claims, and there are always bigger claims, and even the most generous of them do not come close to what we need. To touch 2 receiver groups at the same instant, an animal has to be long enough to reach across the space between them. A 6-meter animal cannot reach across 12.5 meters of cable. It is not a question of how hard it bit, or how fast it was moving, or what angle it came in at. It is a question of the animal being physically shorter than the gap it would have to cross. Those of you who said white shark, and there will be a lot of you, I want you to know that the crew got there first and stayed there longer. That was the working answer on that vessel for months. And the person who eventually stopped believing it was not a biologist. It was a processor in an office a long way from the sea, looking at channel numbers. So we have run out of ordinary answers, and I am aware of exactly how that sounds. I want to slow down here, because this is the point in a story like this, where people stop being careful, and I would rather lose you than do that. Let us take stock of what we actually have, and only what we actually have. We have a working cable at night, with the source shut down. We have 2 adjacent receiver groups going noisy in the same instant, 12.5 meters apart, with a piece of hardware torn sideways off the cable between them. We have a load that arrived and left again 7 seconds later. We have a 30-second clip of black water with something running parallel to the gear. And we have 4 ordinary explanations that each died on a specific named piece of evidence rather than on my opinion of them. That is not proof of an animal. It is a set of constraints, and the constraints are what is interesting, because they are unusually tight. Whatever touched that cable was not less than 12.5 meters long. It was capable of taking a grip firm enough to deform a jacket and tear hardware off a clamp, which is not something a body does by drifting into a cable, and it did that twice. It released cleanly both times, which rules out entanglement and rules out anything that got stuck. It kept pace with a towed spread in the dark without any difficulty. And it did all of this in cold, productive, upwelling water full of seals. Now, what does that describe? It describes a large predatory fish. Not a whale, because whales do not grip and release. Not gear, because gear does not choose. A large predatory fish, at least 12.5 meters long, hunting at night on a coast full of seals. And there is no living animal that fits that description. The largest predatory fish anybody can put in front of you is the white shark at around 6 meters. And we have already established that 6 meters does not reach across 12.5. The whale shark and the basking shark get bigger, and neither one of them takes a grip on anything, because they are filter feeders with mouths built to strain water. A basking shark did not tear a bird off a clamp. So the honest position, and it is uncomfortable, is that the constraints describe an animal that is not supposed to exist. There is exactly one candidate in the fossil record, and you already know its name. Autodus Megalodon. I want to be very careful about how I put this, because there is a version of this argument that is dishonest, and I have no interest in making it. Megalodon is real. It is not cryptozoology, and it is not a legend. It is one of the best attested large animals in the fossil record, because sharks shed teeth continuously through their lives, and those teeth fossilize beautifully, and there are museum drawers on every continent full of them. The size estimates come from those teeth, scaled against the proportions of living lamnids, and the modern published range for the largest individuals sits somewhere between 15 and 20 meters. 15 to 20 meters. Look at our floor again. Not less than 12.5. The measurement we have does not identify the animal, and I will not tell you that it does. What it does is fall inside the only size class that has ever been proposed for a predatory shark, and outside every size class that exists today. And here is the part that everyone gets wrong, including me, for years. The consensus is that Megalodon has been extinct for around 3.5 million years. That is not a guess, and it is not a fudge. It comes from the tooth record, which is enormous and which simply stops. If you find millions of teeth across tens of millions of years, and then you find none, the reasonable conclusion is that the animal stopped being there. I am not going to argue with that. What I am going to point out is what that record actually is, and what it is not. The fossil record of Megalodon is overwhelmingly a record of shallow, coastal, continental shelf environments. That is not because the animal only lived there. It is because that is where sediments accumulate in the way that preserves teeth, and where geologists have spent 200 years looking. A tooth that falls onto an abyssal plain has a vanishingly small chance of ever being found by a human being. So the record tells you, with real authority, that Megalodon stopped being common in the shallow water where we look. It tells you far less than people think about the water where we do not. And the ocean where we do not look is not a small place. It is most of the planet. We have mapped the surface of Mars in more detail than we have mapped our own seabed, and the deep water off a coast like this one is transited constantly and studied almost never. There is a second thing about that extinction that is worth understanding, because it is the strongest argument against everything I have just said, and it deserves to be heard. The leading explanation for why Megalodon disappeared is not that the ocean got too cold or that the food ran out. It is competition. The white shark appears in the record and radiates, and it is smaller, faster, more efficient, and it eats the same things. A leaner competitor turned up, and the big one could not carry the cost of its own body anymore. That argument is good, and I want it to sit next to what we have. Because if that is what happened, then the place a remnant population could persist is not the shallow coastal water where the white shark won. It is exactly the deep, cold, productive water that human beings almost never look at, where the food is abundant enough to pay for a very large body. Which is the water this survey was shooting? I am not telling you that a Megalodon took hold of that cable. I want to be as clear about that as I know how to be, because this file does not support that sentence, and I am not going to pretend it does. What this file supports is narrower and, I think, stranger. Something with a length that no living predatory fish reaches took a deliberate grip on a working cable in the dark, twice, in water that would feed an animal of exactly that size, on a coast where the same category of damage has been quietly logged in the same corner of the same block for 4 seasons. And the only reason anybody can say the first part of that sentence at all is that a piece of survey equipment counts its own sensors and writes down the numbers. Before we go on, I want to bring in the two people in this story who had nothing to gain. Because everything I have shown you so far came from the survey company's own systems, and I am not going to pretend that is the same as independent. The navigator who pulled those records works for the people who own them. He is first-hand, and he is credible, and he is also, unavoidably, an employee, and you should weigh him accordingly. The first person who is not is the marine mammal observer. Every survey of this type carries one, under the conditions of its environmental authorization, and it is worth understanding what that job actually is. They are on the bridge for the entire watch, with binoculars in daylight and a headset at night. And their only function is to notice large animals near the vessel and to stop the survey if one comes too close. They keep their own log, in their own format, in their own hand. And here is the part that matters, because it is not about who signs their contract. That log does not go into the client's data room. It goes to the regulator. It is filed with the authority that granted the permission to shoot the survey in the first place. And it exists specifically so that somebody outside the company can check whether the conditions were kept. The observer that night recorded a full listening watch with no marine mammal detections and recorded the gear fault and recorded the time. Not because they thought it was interesting. Because their form has a box for equipment incidents, and they are the sort of person who fills in every box. The second is a man with no stake at all. Every survey of this size has a chase boat, a smaller vessel that runs ahead of the spread and warns fishing boats and traffic away from 5 miles of cable they cannot see. It is a strange job, and the people who do it are not survey people. They are usually local, they are usually experienced, and they are working for a day rate that does not change no matter what the survey finds. That skipper ran the boat that went out to the damaged section at first light. And he is the only person in this entire account who looked at that cable in daylight, in his hands, from a small boat at the surface, with nothing between him and it. What he describes is not dramatic, and that is why I believe it. He says the cable did not look bitten. He says it looked crushed over a length of it, the way a hose looks when a truck has stood on it, except that the compression ran along a stretch of cable rather than being pressed into one spot. He says the missing bird had not been snapped off, it had been rotated off, and the clamp was deformed in the direction of the rotation. And he says the thing he could not stop thinking about afterwards was not the damage at all. It was that the cable was clean. There was no blood on it, and no tissue, and nothing caught in the fitting. Whatever had taken hold of it had done so without hurting itself in the slightest, which is not what happens when an animal collides with something by accident in the dark. He had been on the water in that region for over 20 years before that morning. He has not offered an opinion about what did it, and he has declined, politely and consistently, every time anybody has asked him to. The only thing he has ever said on the record about that morning is that he does not run alongside a floating cable anymore, and that if his boat is asked to, somebody else takes it. I will come back to him, because what happened next happened to him. There is a question I have been avoiding, and it is the one that decides whether anything in this file is possible. Why here? Why would an animal like this be on this coast, in this water, at all? And the honest answer is that if you were going to look for a very large predatory shark anywhere in the modern ocean, this is close to the first place you would look. This is a cold, upwelling coast. Cold water rises along it, and it comes up carrying nutrients from deep down, and it turns the surface into one of the most productive stretches of ocean on Earth. Productivity means fish. Fish means seals. And the seal colonies on this coast are not small. There are hundreds of thousands of animals hauled out along it, generation after generation, a standing supply of large, warm-bodied prey in one predictable place. That is not a hostile environment for a large shark. That is a dinner table. And the cold, which is the thing everybody assumes rules a big shark out, does not rule anything out at all. There is a family of sharks called the lamnids, and it includes the white shark, the mako, the porbeagle, and the salmon shark. They do something most fish cannot. They hold parts of themselves warmer than the water they are swimming in, using a structure called a rete mirabile, which is a dense countercurrent bundle of blood vessels that traps the heat their own muscles make instead of losing it through the gills. It is not a warm-blooded animal in the way you are. It is a heat exchanger built into the body, and it means a lamnid can keep its swimming muscle, its stomach, its eyes, and its brain above the temperature of the sea around it. The porbeagle and the salmon shark are cold water animals by preference, not by tolerance. They are not surviving the cold. They are using it, because everything worth eating is where the cold water comes up. So the question is not how something like this could stand the temperature on that coast. The question is why we would expect it to be anywhere else. The section came out of the water at first light, and this is the part of the story that I have to tell carefully, because a man does not come home from it. A damaged streamer section is not recovered by winching the whole spread aboard. That takes the better part of a day, and it costs a fortune in vessel time. What you do is put a fast boat on the water, run it out along the cable, find the damage, and either patch it in place or cut the section out and buoy the ends. So the chase boat went out with 2 of the streamer techs aboard, into the grey, alongside a floating cable that ran off into the fog in both directions. They found the section without difficulty. The deformation was obvious in daylight, and the missing bird was obvious, and the 2 of them got hold of the cable and brought it up over the side of the boat to work on it. Which means that for about 20 minutes, at the surface, in the open sea, there were 3 men in a small boat holding on to the thing that had been touched.
Good boat. We are on the section. Tell them to stop the wind.
That is the last routine transmission from that boat. What comes after it is not routine, and I am going to give it to you exactly as it appears in the log, without dressing it. There is a gap of about 40 seconds. Then the bridge calls the boat.
Say again, boat.
The vessel's own deck log records the chase boat back alongside 22 minutes later with 2 men aboard. I have the timings for those 22 minutes, and there is nothing in them that helps. The boat called the vessel. The The vessel called the boat twice and got nothing, and then got an answer that the log records only as broken. The bridge put the ship's own searchlight onto the water in the direction of the cable, which at that hour was of very little use, and began working back down the line. A man in the water beside a floating streamer in a low swell at first light is one of the hardest things in the world to see, and everybody on that bridge knew it. They searched for the rest of that day and most of the next, and a second vessel came across from another block to help. And they found the section of cable, and they found the boat, and they did not find him. The two men who came back have both given accounts, and their accounts agree on everything that can be checked and diverge on the only part that matters. One of them says the cable went first, that it was pulled down and sideways hard enough to take the boat's bow round with it, and that the man on the bow went with the cable. The other says the cable did not move at all until after. That difference has been used to dismiss the whole account, and I understand why. But I would ask you to consider what those two men were doing at that moment. They were both holding a cable. Neither of them was watching the water, because there was no reason on earth to watch the water. They were looking at a piece of damaged equipment in their hands, which is what they were there for. I am not going to show you what happened in the water, because nobody filmed it, and I am not going to invent it for you. What I will tell you is what the file says, which is that the survey stood down, that the remaining recovery was completed with the full spread brought in over the following day, and that the incident report describes a man lost overboard during a small boat operation in open water. Every word of that is true. It is also the last time anybody wrote anything down about that night for 11 months. I have thought a great deal about that 11 months, because it is the part of this story that is hardest to explain to people who have not worked somewhere like that. Nobody was silenced. There was no instruction, no meeting, no lawyer. What there was a completed incident report describing a man lost overboard during a small boat operation, which is true, and a completed gear damage report describing a streamer section lost to fish bite, which is also true. Both forms were correct. Both forms were filed. And once a thing has been correctly filed, it stops being a question and becomes a record. The crew rotated off. The vessel finished the survey and went to another one, in another sea, with another client. The man who reported the noise on those two channels does not work in the industry anymore, and I want to be honest that I do not know whether those two facts have anything to do with each other. The 11 months are not a conspiracy. They are what happens when everybody involved has an explanation that fits on a form and no reason at all to go looking for one that does not. And this is where I expected the story to end, because that is where the paperwork ends. It is not where it ends. 11 months later, a processor working through the block's data for a different client asked a question that nobody on that vessel had thought to ask. Not what happened that night. Whether it had happened before. Because fish bite is a logged category. It has a box on a form, and boxes on forms get filled in, and filled-in forms get kept for years for insurance reasons that have nothing to do with curiosity. So he pulled every fish bite entry from that block over 4 seasons of surveying, and he put them on a chart. He was not looking for an animal. He was looking for a maintenance pattern, because if a particular stretch of water is eating streamers, that is a cost you can plan around. They cluster, not evenly and not across the block. They cluster in one part of it, on the same headings, and almost all of them after dark. The same corner of the same block, year after year, in the same conditions, at the same time of the night. Now, on its own, that is not proof of anything, and I want to be careful here. Clusters have boring explanations. Water depth changes across a block, and so does temperature, and so does the current, and so does the amount of prey, and any of those could concentrate ordinary shark activity in one corner. That is a perfectly good explanation for a cluster of fish bite entries, and I would accept it without argument. But that is not what the chart is doing to this story. Because up to this point, everything I have told you has been about a single night. One incident, one cable, one number, one animal that took hold twice and let go twice. And a single incident is a story about an animal that passed through. There is one more thing on that chart that I did not expect, and it is the detail that made me want to make this film. The cluster is not just in one part of the block. It sits over a specific piece of ground. The seabed under that corner is not flat. There is a break in the slope there, the kind of feature that concentrates current and concentrates everything that lives in current. And it is exactly the sort of place that the survey was shooting in order to understand. That is the part that I find difficult to put down. The survey went to that corner because the geology underneath it was interesting. And the geology underneath it is interesting for the same reason that the water above it is worth an animal's time. They were both there for the same feature. One of them was looking down through it, and one of them was living on it. And for 4 seasons, the only thing that ever passed between them was a cable and a form. A cluster is a story about an animal that lives there. That is the difference, and it is the whole reason this file is worth anything. Nobody deleted it, and I want to say that as clearly as I can, because I know exactly what the comments under this video are going to say. There is no cover-up here. There is no missing tape, and no non-disclosure agreement, and no man in a suit who came aboard. What happened is more ordinary than that, and to me, considerably worse. Seismic data is a product. It is shot on speculation or under contract, it is processed, and it is sold. And what the client buys is a clean, interpretable image of the rock underneath the seabed. They are not buying a record of the ocean. They are buying a picture of the geology, and everything in that recording that is not geology is, by definition, noise. Noise gets removed. That is not misconduct. That is the job. A processor sitting in an office looks at a gather full of traces, sees 2 channels that are full of rubbish, and takes them out, because leaving them in would degrade the image the client paid for. He is not covering anything up. He is doing the thing he was hired to do, competently, and if he did not do it, he would be bad at his job. And here is what I keep coming back to. When you remove a bad trace, you do not just delete it. You write down what you removed. Every processing sequence carries an edit log, because the next person to touch that data has to know what was taken out and why, and because a client who is spending that kind of money is entitled to know what was done to their image. So there is a document. It is not a secret document. It is a routine, boring, technical record, and it lists, by channel number, exactly which receiver groups were taken out of that record, on what line, at what time. 2 adjacent channels, 12.5 meters apart, taken out on the same shot record, at the same instant, for the same reason. The company measured the animal in the act of deleting it. The cover-up document and the measurement are the same piece of paper. Nobody involved has ever realized that, because nobody involved was ever asking what the noise was. They were asking whether the image was clean. I want to come back to that 30 seconds of footage now, because I have not been straight with you about it, and it has been bothering me. I told you at the start that you cannot see an animal in that clip, and that is true. What I did not tell you is when it was recorded. It is not from the moment the cable was touched. That camera is on a tow point much further forward, and the timestamp on that clip puts it about 40 minutes earlier on the same line before anything had happened at all. So the thing running alongside the gear in that footage is not a thing reacting to a survey. It is a thing that was already there, keeping station with 8 kilometers of moving cable in the dark, doing nothing for as long as the camera was pointed at it. For 40 minutes before anybody on that ship knew anything was wrong, something was swimming beside the equipment and matching its speed. And it had not touched it yet. And it is. The image is clean, and it went to a client, and it was interpreted, and it was drilled against, and it did its job. And somewhere in an archive, there is a processing report with 2 channel numbers in it that is the only ruler anybody has ever had against this animal. The cable is not on that ship anymore. Streamer sections get repaired, respooled, and redistributed across a fleet. And the section that was touched that night was cut out, replaced, and the rest of that cable went back to work. It is on another vessel now, somewhere, being dragged through the dark tonight behind somebody who has never heard this story, doing the only job it has ever done, which is to notice things and write down where they were. And every so often, in one particular corner of one particular block, on a certain heading, after dark, somebody on a back deck sees the noise come up on a channel and reaches for the form. There is a box on it. The box says, "Fish bite." There is one more thing, and then I will leave this alone. When I started pulling this file apart, I assumed the interesting question was what took hold of that cable. It is not, and I have come round to thinking it is not even close. The interesting question is how many other machines are out there right now, doing something completely unrelated to biology, accidentally recording things that nobody will ever look at. Because that is what this was. This was not a research vessel, and this was not a survey of the ocean. This was a commercial operation looking through the water at the rock underneath it and treating everything in between as an obstruction. The ocean is full of instruments like that. Cables, moorings, autonomous vehicles, port sonars, cable repair ships, offshore wind arrays, every one of them recording continuously. Every one of them owned by somebody who is interested in exactly one thing and is contractually obliged to throw the rest away. We have never had more sensors in the sea than we have today, and we have never been less interested in most of what they hear. Somewhere in that discarded data is every large animal that has passed within range of a working machine in the last 30 years. The file I have shown you survived by accident because a processor happened to write down 2 channel numbers on his way to deleting them. I would like to know what is in the rest of it.